3 generations of imbeciles are enough. These are the words of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. in the conclusion of the Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell. This conflict marked the lawful beginning of the eugenics movement in the United States, leading to the sterilization of over 60,000 Americans and setting a precedent for more than 500,000 other surgeries around the world. Though this law was not questioned at the time, we understand this case as a compromise of the Supreme Court's values to protect Americans.
In the history of American law, there is no case like Buck v. Bell. It's the only occasion in which the Supreme Court of the United States has allowed surgery on a person who didn't wish to be operated on and who didn't need the procedure. The case was built on false facts, false theories, and false science. And it was used as a model not only in the United States, but all over the rest of the world.
Prior to this era, Darwin released his theory of natural selection, the idea in which organisms develop favorable traits over time, eventually altering the overall genotype. In 1883, Sir Francis Galton was accredited with the creation of a new social movement, eugenics.
I mean, the people who supported eugenics included the president of Harvard University, the first president of Stanford, Theodore Roosevelt, Alexander Graham Bell, and universities across the country taught eugenics. It was very popular in the popular press and in best-selling books. This was a mass movement. People believed we needed to uplift the race by changing our gene pool.
This movement sought to improve the genetic composition of society by weeding out the weak, less intelligent, and less desirable members. During the 1920s, director of the Eugenics Record Office in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, Harry Laughlin published his Model Sterilization Act, which allowed for the involuntary sterilization of inmates in public institutions. By the 1930s, over 30 states had adopted Laughlin's model. Some states included blindness, deafness, drug addiction, and alcoholism, with the traits considered undesirable, meeting the criteria for involuntary sterilization. In 1924, in Lynchburg, Virginia, this sterilization law alienated a young woman named Carrie Buck. Since the age of 3, Carrie lived with the foster family, the Dobbs. After she became pregnant, the family committed her to the Virginia colony of epileptics and feeble-minded, even though she showed no signs of developmental delays. Albert Priddy, the superintendent of the colony, saw no evidence of psychosis in Carrie. Priddy wanted to enact mass sterilization in his institution, utilizing the Virginia Sterilization Act based off of Laughlin's law. As his first step, he selected Carrie Buck as a defendant in the Amherst County Circuit Court case to ensure the Virginia sterilization law could advance to the national legislature. Since Carrie's mother and daughter were also considered feeble-minded, Priddy selected her as the perfect test subject for his case.
Carrie was examined by doctors who claimed that she was feeble-minded, but that term didn't have too much meaning in 1924. Emma also went through certain tests and was considered somehow defective, to use the language of the day. But it's unlikely that either of them had any serious mental illnesses or other problems. More than their mental state, their moral state was at issue here. They were considered people who had sex too often with the wrong people. They were considered loose women.
However, Carrie and her daughter Vivian both received adequate marks in school, and Vivian later made the honor roll. Once the colony's board had enough votes to sterilize Carrie, they asked her state-appointed guardian, Robert G. Shelton, to appoint an attorney for Carrie in the sterilization litigation. Shelton chose Irving P. Whitehead to represent Carrie. He was a former colony director, sterilization advocate, and a friend of Albert Priddy. Then the case was brought to the Amherst County Circuit Court on October 3, 1924. The people subpoenaed to testify against Carrie had little relation or knowledge of Carrie and her predicament. Whitehead did not cross-examine or call any witnesses to Carrie's defense. Also, the intelligence testing performed to display Carrie's feeble-mindedness was untruthful. The mental examiner inflated Carrie's formal education experience, thus leading to Carrie being held to a higher intellectual standard. As a result, the court sided with the colony and ruled Carrie was feeble-minded and eligible for sterilization. Then the case proceeded to the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals. There, Aubrey Strode, the colony's lawyer, argued that the Virginia Sterilization Act protected public health and safety by preventing the reproduction of socially inadequate citizens. Strode asserted that the sterilization law did not violate the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution, protecting citizens from cruel and unusual punishment because all individuals deemed feeble-minded would be treated equally through sterilization. Carey's lawyer Whitehead presented almost no factual evidence during the trial, nor did he contest Carey's feeble-mindedness or question the feeble-mindedness of Carey's child Vivian. Furthermore, Whitehead often reiterated Strode's arguments for sterilization. Again, the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals affirmed Carey's sterilization order on November 12, 1925. This decision advanced the case to the United States Supreme Court, which was accepted for review in September of 1926. Since Albert Priddy died of lymphoma, the plaintiff in the Supreme Court case transferred to the next superintendent of the colony, John Bell. Whitehead raised new objections about due process and stated that the 14th Amendment's protection of life, liberty, and property allowed people like Carey Buck the right to go through life with full bodily integrity. Whitehead also focused on questioning a patient's benefit from sterilization. Whitehead wrote that if the law was held to be constitutional, the power of the state to rid itself of undesirable citizens was unlimited. However, he failed to emphasize that these ideas conflict with the Supreme Court's sacred right, allowing every individual to have the possession and control of his or her own person. Throughout the case, experts had no factual basis for their testimonies. For example, they testified that Carey Buck would be able to live on her own if she was unable to reproduce. However, they had no way of knowing if this was true because she was never given the chance to live independently, as her foster family sent her to an institution when she was only 17 years old. And though Vivian's feeble-mindedness was key to proving the heredity of feeble-mindedness in the trial, Carey's baby of only 8 months underwent no definitive testing. After the decision in 1927, there was a swift rise in the amount of involuntary sterilization in the United States. Also, anti-immigration statutes and stricter laws, such as the anti-miscegenation laws, were pushed by American eugenicists to try and prevent racially mixed marriages. The mindset that America must remain American fell over the country. In support of this theory, fitter family contests were held at county fairs to educate the population and promote a perfect human race in America. The ideas of eugenics and race purification are commonly associated with Nazi Germany, but the strength of the eugenics movement in the United States is less widely known, despite the vanguard role of American scientists.
There was friendship and cooperation between the American eugenicists and important scientists in America and the Nazis.
Germany's Nazi government adopted a law for protection against genetically defective offspring, using language from Harry Laughlin's Model Eugenical Law.
The Nazis actually followed us. We were the leaders in eugenic sterilization. Indiana passed a eugenic sterilization law in 1907, well before the rise of the Nazi Party. They were looking to America. Harry Laughlin was in correspondence with the Nazi scientists throughout this whole period. They were looking to him for advice about how to set up a eugenic sterilization program. He wrote with pride in his Eugenics magazine that they based the Nazi eugenic law on his American law.
This Nazi law provided the legal basis for sterilizations in Germany. In its first full year of implementation, about 80,000 people were sterilized without their consent. Superintendent of the Virginia colony, Dr. John Bell, theorized about global acceptance of sterilization, writing, "The fact that a great state like the German Republic has in its wisdom seen fit to enact a national eugenic legislative act seems to point the way for an eventual worldwide adoption of this idea." Additionally, Nazi posters bold a phrase that translates to "We do not stand alone," listing the United States as the first and foremost nation in its allies in eugenics, indicating that the United States inspired the Nazis to develop and execute its own eugenic plans. By 1974, Virginia repealed the sterilization law, but not before it led to the forced sterilization of over 65,000 Americans with mental or developmental disabilities. Looking back, this case is considered one of the worst decisions made by the Supreme Court. Between the largely controversial concept of sterilization for social benefit, Carey's poor representation in the court system, and the perverse reasoning for the decision, Buck v. Bell epitomizes the conflict of the court deciphering right from wrong for our country's citizens. Furthermore, the Supreme Court compromised their duty to protect the basic human rights of American citizens by approving the sterilization of people with developmental disabilities and by not challenging the lack of integrity in the case.